You know that person who used to be everywhere? Group chats, family dinners, always the first to show up and the last to leave. And then one day, quietly, they just disappeared. No big fight, no dramatic goodbye. They just pulled back, one person at a time, until the circle got smaller and smaller, and then almost nothing. Maybe that person is someone you loved, maybe that person is you. And if it is you, I need you to stay with me, because what I'm about to share is going to explain something about yourself that you've never been able to fully put into words. Today, we're going inside the psychology of people who cut everyone off, not the ones who ghost without reason, not the ones who are just antisocial, the ones who loved deeply, gave everything, and then one day made a quiet decision to stop. Science has a lot to say about this, and by the end, you're going to understand what it actually means. Let's start with something most people get completely wrong. When someone cuts people off, the first assumption is always that something is wrong with them. They're cold, they're damaged. Society has a word for it. They call it avoidant, like it's a diagnosis, like there's something broken that needs fixing. But here's what the research actually shows. A 2021 study on social withdrawal found that for many, pulling back isn't a symptom of dysfunction. It's a response to an overwhelming accumulation of experiences that were never fully processed. In other words, it's not that these people don't know how to connect. It's that they connected so deeply, so many times, and got so little back that the math eventually stopped making sense. Think about that for a second. The person who cuts everyone off isn't usually the one who never cared. It's almost always the one who cared too much, for too long, for too many people who weren't paying attention. And that changes everything about how we understand this. There's a concept in psychology called emotional bandwidth. It's essentially the capacity a person has to give before they hit their limit. And here's the thing, it's not unlimited. For most people, it refills with rest, with reciprocity, with moments of genuine connection. But for those who overgive, something else happens. For people who absorb other people's problems, who show up fully even when no one shows up for them, the bandwidth doesn't just get depleted, it gets damaged. Over time, the nervous system associates closeness with exhaustion. It starts to link vulnerability with pain. And so, slowly, the brain does what it always does when something causes repeated harm. It starts to protect you from it. Cutting people off, in many cases, is not a choice made from strength or indifference. It's a biological survival response. Your nervous system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It learned that certain patterns lead to pain, and it's trying to stop the cycle. Now, I want to tell you about something called the fawn response, because I think this is the missing piece. You've probably heard of fight, flight, and freeze. These are the three responses most people know, but there's a fourth one, identified by therapist Pete Walker, and it's called fawn. The fawn response is what happens when a person learns, usually early in life, that the safest way to survive is to prioritize the needs and emotions of others above their own, to agree, to smooth things over. People who grew up in chaotic households with emotionally unpredictable parents often develop a deeply ingrained fawn response. They live their whole lives making themselves smaller. Until one day something shifts. The exhaustion becomes unbearable. The resentment builds quietly in the background, and they realize who they are in their relationships is not who they actually are. When a person who has been fawning for years finally starts to reclaim their sense of self, the relationships that were built on the old version of them often don't survive. And that's not always because those people are bad. Sometimes it's simply because the dynamic no longer works when one person starts having boundaries, when the one who always said yes starts saying no. The relationship was built on an imbalance. Connections fall apart, not with a fight, not with a confrontation, just with a slow fade, and the person who withdraws gets labeled as cold or changed or difficult, but they're finally becoming honest. Let's talk about something that might feel uncomfortable. Some people who cut everyone off are not healing, they are hiding, and there is a difference, and it matters. Healing looks like intentional solitude. It's quiet, but it's active. It involves processing, reflection, and an eventual movement towards selective reconnection with people who are safe. If you're someone who has cut people off and you're watching this, I want to ask you something honest. When you're alone, does it feel like rest or does it feel like relief from something you can't quite name? Because one of those is self-preservation, and the other one might be something worth exploring with a professional. You deserve more than just the absence of pain. You deserve the presence of something good. Researchers who study social withdrawal have identified a specific profile. These are not typically people who are low in empathy. In fact, they tend to score very high on measure of empathy and emotional intelligence. They are often highly perceptive, attuned to subtleties in social dynamics that other people miss entirely. They notice when someone is performing friendship rather than actually being a friend. There's a term for this, empathic overload. It's what happens when someone is so attuned to the emotional states around them that simply being in social situations becomes mentally and physically taxing. For someone with this trait, a crowded party isn't just loud. It's an overwhelming flood of emotional data that has to be sorted and managed in real time. A difficult conversation is replayed for days afterward. So when these people pull back, what looks like antisocial behavior is actually a highly intelligent system managing its own limits. They're not avoiding connection, they're protecting their capacity for it. Most of them don't actually want to be alone. They want relationships where they don't have to manage how they're being perceived, where they can be honest. When every relationship requires a version of them that isn't real, they stop paying. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough: the grief of cutting people off. It carries real loss. There's a mourning period that happens privately, away from anyone who would understand. There's a silence around this pain. And yet for many, the grief still feels lighter than staying. That's how you know the cost had become too high, when the sadness of leaving is still somehow easier to carry than the weight of remaining. I want to say this plainly: cutting people off is not failure. For certain people, radical simplification of their social world is necessary. It's the thing that allows them to stop bleeding out, to stop performing. The research on authentic social connections is clear. Having fewer, higher quality relationships is significantly better for mental health than having many shallow ones. The person cutting from 50 to 5 is not losing. But the goal is not to arrive at 0. The goal is not to become an island. The end game is discernment, the ability to tell the difference between a relationship that costs you your identity and one that allows you to have one. This behavior almost always comes from love, from a person who felt things deeply. Be gentle with yourself if that person is you. Be gentle with the person if it was someone you loved. The story is rarely what it looks like from the outside. The people who cut everyone off are often the ones capable of the deepest connection. They just need it to be real. If this video described you, share it with someone you care about. I'll see you there.